Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The Ticking Heart of Harlem. Before the roar of Junkers bombers drowned out the chiming of St. Bavo's Cathedral, the world of the Ten Boom family was one of meticulous order and quiet faith. The year is 1939. Their home, known as the Beje, located at 19 Barteldrastraat in the center of Harlem, is a quirky, narrow house, its ground floor occupied by the family's watch and clock shop for exactly 102 years. Archival photographs show a storefront filled with gleaming timepieces, a testament to precision and reliability. The family patriarch, 80-year-old Casper Ten Boom, is a beloved figure in the city. A master craftsman whose gentle demeanor and deep Dutch Reformed faith are as much a part of the shop as the gears and springs he so expertly handles. His daughters, the pious and frail Betsy and the practical, unmarried 47-year-old Corrie, manage the shop and home with him. Their life, like the clocks they sell, runs on a predictable, comforting rhythm of work, prayer, and community service. They are, by every definition, ordinary people. Their equipment consists of watchmakers' loops and tiny screwdrivers, their strategy the daily management of a small business. Yet, their biography is steeped in a particular brand of Calvinist theology that holds a deep respect for the Jewish people as God's ancient people. This theological conviction, long a dormant part of their identity, would soon become the central gear in a machine of life-or-death resistance. On May 10, 1940, the illusion of Dutch neutrality was shattered. The German blitzkrieg rolled over the Netherlands in 5 days. From the windows of the Beje, the Ten Booms could hear the distant thud of anti-aircraft guns and see the sky scarred by Luftwaffe planes. The familiar ticking of their clocks was now a countdown to an unknown and terrifying future. The occupation began subtly, but the methodical tightening of the Nazi grip would force this family of watchmakers to confront a choice: to remain silent bystanders or to turn their home into a sanctuary. A place where time, for the hunted, might not run out. The shadow of the swastika. The initial phase of the German occupation, from 1940 to 1941, was a masterclass in psychological warfare and gradualism. The Nazi strategy was not to incite immediate, widespread rebellion, but to slowly boil the frog. Official decrees, stamped with the German eagle, began appearing on public buildings. Curfews were imposed. Radios were confiscated, save for German-approved devices, forcing many like the Ten Booms to acquire a second, illegal radio to listen to the BBC's Radio Orange, the voice of the Dutch government in exile. This small act of defiance, this technological rebellion, was for many Dutch citizens the first step into the world of the underground. For the Ten Booms, the true horror began with the laws targeting their Jewish neighbors. First came the registration requirements. Then the seizure of Jewish-owned businesses. The Ten Booms watched in silent anguish as the owner of a neighboring fur shop was forced out. Then came the Yellow Star of David, a symbol meant to humiliate and isolate. Corrie's personal diaries and post-war testimony recount her visceral reaction. She purchased stars herself, intending to wear one in solidarity until her pastor wisely counseled that such an act would land her in prison, rendering her useless for any real help. The economic context of the occupation became starkly clear. Ration cards were introduced for food, clothing, and fuel, creating a system of state-controlled survival. This system, however, had a fatal flaw for the Jewish population. As they were stripped of their rights and forced into hiding, they lost access to these legal means of existence. To survive, they needed a new source of sustenance, a shadow economy of courage and conspiracy. It was a logistical problem that the Dutch resistance began to tackle with desperate ingenuity, and the Beje, with its constant flow of customers and its central location, was perfectly poised to become a node in this nascent network. The moral question was no longer abstract. It was walking down their street, wearing a yellow star, with fear in its eyes. The first knock at the door. The turning point from passive sympathy to active, high-stakes resistance occurred on a cold evening in late 1941. A Jewish woman named Mrs. Clearmaker, her face etched with fear, appeared at the Beje. Her husband had been arrested, her son had gone into hiding, and she was terrified she would be next. She asked a simple, terrifying question: Could she stay with them? In that moment, the theoretical teachings of their faith collided with the brutal reality of the occupation. Hiding a Jew was a capital offense. A single informant, a careless word, could mean the arrest, torture, and death of the entire Ten Boom family. A family meeting was convened. The archival record, based on Corrie's own detailed recollections in the hiding place, captures the solemnity of the moment. It was Casper, the patriarch, who articulated their decision. When Corrie expressed her fear that they could all be killed for this, Casper's response became the family's moral charter. "I would consider it an honor," he said calmly, "to give my life for God's ancient people." With those words, the decision was made. The Ten Booms' war had begun. Mrs. Clearmaker was their first onderduiker, or person in hiding. Her arrival fundamentally altered the Beje. The house was no longer just a home and a shop, it was a safe house, a secret fortress. The tactical challenges were immediate. Where would she sleep? How would she use the bathroom without arousing the suspicion of the neighbors who shared thin walls with them? How would they acquire food for an extra person with the strict rationing system in place? This first act of defiance set in motion a chain of events that would transform Corrie from a spinster watchmaker into a key operative in the Harlem underground. She was now responsible not only for her own life, but for the life of another, and soon, many more. The ticking of the clocks in the shop below now sounded less like the passage of time and more like a bomb, counting down to either liberation or discovery. Weaving the invisible network. Saving one person was a risk, saving dozens required a sophisticated organization. The Beje quickly evolved from a single point of refuge into the central command post for a sprawling network across the Harlem region. Corrie Ten Boom, the unassuming shopkeeper, became its unlikely quartermaster and field agent. Her biographical trajectory during 1942 to 1943 is astonishing. Leveraging her family's sterling reputation and her wide circle of acquaintances, she began to build an army of ordinary citizens. This was a cellular resistance structure, a crucial tactic to ensure that if one person was caught, they could not betray the entire organization. The network had specialists. There was a police officer who would warn them of upcoming raids, a civil servant who had access to the rationing office, and homeowners throughout the countryside willing to take in Jews for longer-term hiding. The logistical and economic challenges were immense. The primary currency of this underground railroad was the ration card. To feed the growing number of people in hiding, the divers, Corrie needed hundreds of illegal cards each month. Her first foray into this dangerous world was to a man named Fred Cornstra, who worked at the ration office. Corrie's account of this meeting is filled with palpable tension. She asked for 100 stolen ration cards, a request so audacious it could have been a Gestapo trap. His terrified agreement marked a major breakthrough. This act of bureaucratic sabotage was as vital to the war effort as blowing up a bridge. The network grew, eventually comprising around 80 young men and women who acted as couriers, scouts, and escorts. They used code words over the telephone. Discussions about watch repairs would signify the movement of a guest. The Ten Boom Watch Shop, a place of public commerce, became the perfect cover. Resistance members could enter and exit without raising suspicion, exchanging information, forged documents, and life-saving ration cards over the watch counter, right under the noses of passing German patrols. The Beje had become the heart of a secret body, pumping people, food, and information through the arteries of occupied Holland. The architecture of hope. As the number of refugees passing through the Beje increased, it became clear that a temporary solution for hiding was insufficient. A nighttime raid by the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the intelligence agency of the SS, would leave them with nowhere to run. They needed a purpose-built, undetectable hiding place. The technology of concealment became their new obsession. Through their resistance connections, they were introduced to a man known only as Mr. Smit, a famous Dutch architect who was a master of creating such secret spaces, or Schwilplaatsen. He arrived at the Beje posing as a customer and surveyed the house with a practiced eye. The layout of the old, convoluted building was both a challenge and an opportunity. He chose Corrie's own bedroom on the top floor. Its north-facing wall adjoined the central staircase and the rest of the house. His plan was ingenious. He would build a false brick wall inside Corrie's room, creating a secret chamber approximately 2.5 feet deep and the width of the room. The entrance would be a small sliding panel, concealed within a newly built, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf. Analysis of the design, based on post-war reconstructions and Corrie's descriptions, reveals its brilliance. The space was tiny, but it had a ventilation system consisting of small, cleverly disguised grills that allowed air to pass through from the main house. Inside, a small mattress, a water jug, and a bucket could be stored. Mr. Smith's team of resistance builders completed the work in a matter of days, the sounds of construction masked by the daily noise of the city. The finished product was a masterpiece of deception. The new brick wall was plastered and aged to look identical to the others. Even tapping on it yielded no hollow sound. With the hiding place complete, a new tactical regimen began, the drill. A buzzer was installed in the shop, which could be pressed to signal a raid. Day and night, the 10 Booms and their permanent guests, a group of 6 Jews and resistance workers living semi-permanently in the house, would practice. The goal was to clear the house of any trace of illegal occupants and for all 6 to disappear into the secret room in under 1 minute. They drilled relentlessly, knocking over chairs, spilling food, their hearts pounding. The hiding place was now ready. It was a tiny pocket of freedom, engineered with brick and mortar, held together by courage, and waiting for the inevitable day it would be needed. The permanent guests and the rules of invisibility. By mid-1943, the Beje was no longer just a temporary transit station, it had become a long-term residence for a group of people who had nowhere else to go. These 6 individuals became the 10 Booms' secret family. They included a distinguished cantor from Amsterdam, an elderly Jewish couple named Mr. and Mrs. Weil, and 3 other members of the Dutch resistance. Their very existence transformed the house into a theater of perpetual silence and stealth. The human factor became paramount. Managing the psychological well-being of 6 terrified people in enforced confinement was as critical as managing the logistics of their survival. Life was governed by a strict set of tactical rules, an unwritten martial law of invisibility. During the day, when the watch shop was open, absolute silence was mandatory. The guests could not walk, cough, or even whisper. They learned to communicate in sign language, their world shrinking to the confines of the upper floors. The simple act of flushing a toilet was a calculated risk. It was permitted only when the bell over the shop door rang, its chime providing auditory camouflage for the sound of rushing water. Betsy 10 Boom, whose frail health had always been a concern, revealed a genius for domestic logistics. With ration cards procured by Corrie, she would perform daily miracles, stretching meager supplies of potatoes and bread to feed a household that had secretly more than doubled in size. The economic strain was immense, but Betsy's resourcefulness, rooted in a lifetime of thrift and faith, became a critical weapon in their domestic war. The drills for the hiding place became more frequent and intense. The buzzer would sound at random times, during meals, in the middle of the night, and the 6 guests, along with any visiting resistance members, would have to scramble. Their lives depended on muscle memory and speed. From the living room to the top-floor bedroom and through the sliding panel into darkness, the entire sequence had to be executed in under 60 seconds. These drills were a constant, jarring reminder of their precarious reality, a physical manifestation of the terror that simmered just beneath the surface of their quiet, ordered existence. The house itself, once a place of comfort, was now a paradox, a sanctuary that demanded the vigilance of a prison. The betrayal and the raid. February 28, 1944, began as any other day in the occupied Netherlands, cold, gray, and tense. Archival records and Corrie's own meticulous testimony paint a chillingly detailed picture of the day the 10 Boom network was shattered. At midday, a Dutch man named Jan Vogel entered the watch shop. He appeared distressed, explaining that he and his wife were hiding Jews and were in desperate need of money to keep them safe. He knew of Corrie's work through the underground and appealed to her compassion. Though Corrie felt a deep sense of unease, an instinct honed by 2 years of clandestine work, her desire to help overrode her suspicion. She agreed to give him the money. It was a fatal mistake. Jan Vogel was a collaborator, an informant paid by the Gestapo. He had been sent to confirm that the Beje was the nerve center of the Harlem resistance. The trap was now set. At approximately 5:30 p.m., as the family and their guests were gathered, the quiet was broken by the harsh, authoritative shouts from the street below. Peeking through the curtains, Corrie saw them, Gestapo agents in their long leather coats, surrounding the house. Her brother Willem's son, Kik, who was visiting, calmly pressed the secret buzzer. The drill, practiced so many times, was now real. A surge of adrenaline-fueled panic and precision exploded through the house. Plates clattered, chairs were knocked over. The 6 permanent guests, the elderly Wiles, the cantor, and 3 others, flew up the stairs. Mary Italy, an elderly woman with asthmatic breathing, was the slowest. Her labored gasps echoed in the stairwell as she was helped into the dark cavity. The sliding panel closed just as the heavy thud of rifle butts splintered the shop's front door. The raid was brutally efficient. Gestapo and SD officers swarmed the house. Corrie, Beje, and their 84-year-old father Casper were thrown against the wall. The house was ransacked with methodical violence. Though the hiders were safely concealed, the Gestapo found what they needed: a stack of illegal ration cards, Corrie's briefcase containing resistance paperwork, and the extra bedding in the upstairs rooms, all damning evidence. The family stood silently, their faces pale but resolute. The hiding place had held. The people were safe. But for the tin booms, their war had just entered its most brutal phase. A father's final testimony. The raid on the Beje was a devastating blow to the Dutch underground. The Gestapo's trap had been horrifically successful. In addition to Corrie, Beje, Casper, and their brother Willem and sister Noli, who were visiting, over 20 other resistance members who came to the house for the regular afternoon meeting were arrested as they walked in. The Gestapo had created a dragnet, and the tin boom home was the bait. All were taken to the local police headquarters for interrogation. It was here, in a cold, sterile room, that Casper Ten Boom gave his final, and most powerful, act of defiance. The lead Gestapo officer, impressed by the old man's dignity and perhaps seeking to show a sliver of magnanimity, offered him a deal. He gestured to the others arrested. "I'd like to send you home, old man," the officer said, his voice a mix of condescension and curiosity. "I'll take your word that you won't cause any more trouble." He was offering Casper his life and freedom in exchange for a simple promise to cease his resistance work. The archival testimonies from others in the room described Casper drawing himself up to his full, though frail, height. He looked the officer in the eye, his voice clear and unwavering. "If I go home today," he declared, "tomorrow I will open my door again to any man in need who knocks." The officer stared, dumbfounded. He was a product of the Nazi system, a world of coercion, power, and fear. Casper's motivation, a selfless, spiritual conviction, was a language he could not comprehend. The offer was rescinded. Casper Ten Boom was transported with the others to the infamous Scheveningen prison. 10 days later, on March 9, 1944, at the age of 84, he died in a hospital corridor, having never even been assigned a cell due to overcrowding. His last conscious act was a prayer for the people he had sheltered. He had, as he once told Corrie, considered it an honor. His death was the first great sacrifice the family would pay. The silent wait in the secret room. While the Tin Booms were being interrogated, another drama was unfolding in the absolute darkness of the hiding place. The 6 hiders, 4 Jews and 2 resistance fighters, were entombed. The success of their lightning-fast escape was now their prison. Through the ventilation slats, they could hear everything: the smashing of furniture, the guttural shouts of the Gestapo officers, the terrifying silence that followed the arrests, and then, the eerie quiet of an occupied, empty house. The architectural genius of Mr. Smith's design was now being tested under the most extreme conditions. The SD posted guards in the house, hoping to catch any returning resistance members. For 2 days, the hiders remained frozen, barely daring to breathe. Mary Italy's asthma was a constant threat. The others would muffle her desperate coughs with blankets. The tiny chamber, designed for short-term concealment, became a crucible of psychological endurance. They had no food and only a small jug of water. The bucket designated as a toilet filled quickly. The darkness was total, a disorienting void that erased time and amplified every sound from the house below. They heard the guards walking in Corrie's room, just feet from their faces. They heard them tapping on the walls, searching for hollow spots. Each tap was a hammer blow to their nerves. Their greatest torment was ignorance. What had happened to the 10 booms? Were they alive? Had they been tortured? Had anyone betrayed the secret of the room? To leave would mean certain capture and death, not only for themselves but for anyone who might try to help them. To stay meant risking starvation or discovery. Their survival depended on the one thing they had almost run out of: hope. On the third day, the German guards finally departed. A member of the resistance network, a young nursing student who worked as a courier, managed to slip into the house and give the all-clear signal. Stiff, dehydrated, and traumatized, the 6 people emerged from the wall. They had survived. All the watches in your cabinet, as the later coded message would say, are safe. The Orange Hotel encoded messages. After Casper's death, the remaining family members were scattered throughout the Nazi prison system. Corrie and Beje were held at the Scheveningen political prison, grimly nicknamed the Orange Hotel, by the Dutch people after the Royal House of Orange. Here, the Nazi strategy of dehumanization was systematically applied. Corrie was thrust into solitary confinement, a tactical measure designed to induce psychological collapse. The human-to-human contact that had defined her life was replaced by 4 concrete walls, a wooden plank for a bed, and utter isolation. Her diary, later written on smuggled scraps of paper, documents her battle against despair. The physical misery of lice, freezing cold, and near starvation was matched by the mental anguish of not knowing her family's fate. Yet, even in this controlled environment, resistance continued. Corrie discovered she could communicate with the prisoner in the adjacent cell by shouting through the shared floorboards. More importantly, the 10-bone network, though wounded, was not dead. During a brief gathering for the reading of Casper's Wool, a strange act of bureaucratic civility in the midst of barbarism, Noli managed to pass Corrie a small package. Disguised as a cookie, it contained a small, complete Bible, its pages tissue-thin, and knitting needles. The Bible became her primary tool for survival, a source of immense psychological and spiritual strength. Later, another package arrived from Noli, a simple red towel. But hidden within its threads were more knitting needles and yarn. This was no ordinary gift. Corrie unraveled the yarn and knitted it into a sweater, but as she worked, she could feel small, hard lumps. She carefully extracted tiny, rolled-up messages. One contained the devastating news of her father's death. Another, however, carried the coded message that brought a surge of triumphant joy through her solitary cell: all the watches in your cabinet are safe. The code was clear. The 6 people in the hiding place had been rescued. In that moment, Corrie knew their sacrifice had not been in vain. The knowledge fortified her. The Gestapo had taken her home and her family, but they had not won. Transfer to Voot. In June 1944, after 3 months in Scheveningen, Corrie and Beje's ordeal escalated. They were herded onto a packed prison train, the destination unknown. This was a common tactic used by the Nazi regime. The disorientation and terror of transport were integral to the process of breaking prisoners' spirits. The train rumbled eastward, and upon arrival, they were disgorged into Camp Voot, a political concentration camp in the Netherlands. Voot represented a significant shift in their internment. While Scheveningen was a prison, Voot was a labor camp, a cog in the vast German war economy. The analysis of its structure reveals a dual purpose: to extract forced labor and to terrorize the Dutch population into submission. Here, Corrie and Beje were no longer individuals with names but were reduced to numbers, part of an anonymous mass of political prisoners. Corrie was assigned to the Philips factory, a special section within the camp where inmates were forced to produce electronics for the German military, specifically radio tubes for aircraft and V-2 rockets. This created a profound moral dilemma. The work she was doing was directly aiding the Nazi war effort. However, the Philips foreman, a sympathetic civilian, engineered a subtle form of sabotage. He taught the prisoners to do their work just poorly enough to ensure the radios would fail quality inspections, but not so poorly that the flaw would be traced back to them. It was a minuscule but potent act of resistance, a continuation of the war on a microscopic, technological level. The human factors in Voot were brutal. The daily roll call, or appel, lasted for hours in all weather. The food was thin soup and a crust of black bread. Disease was rampant. Yet, it was here that Betsy Ten Boom's extraordinary character began to shine with an almost supernatural brilliance. Frail and often ill, she organized secret prayer meetings in the barracks, using the smuggled Bible as their focal point. While Corrie's strength was practical and organizational, Betsy's was spiritual, and she began to articulate a philosophy of radical forgiveness that would become the core of their survival strategy. The red sweater and the miracle of the Bible. As the Allied armies advanced through France after the D-Day landings, the German camp system was thrown into chaos. In September 1944, with Allied forces approaching the Dutch border, Voot was hastily evaluated. Corrie, Betsy, and the other female prisoners were crammed into suffocating cattle cars, with no food, water, or sanitation, for a grueling 3-day journey. This was the infamous transport, a weapon of attrition in itself. Many prisoners, particularly the elderly and sick, did not survive the trip. Their destination was Ravensbrück, the Third Reich's largest concentration camp exclusively for women, located deep inside Germany, north of Berlin. Upon arrival, the process of dehumanization was reinitiated with horrifying efficiency. They were stripped of all remaining possessions. Corrie, however, had managed to hide her most precious items, the Bible, a bottle of vitamins, and the blue sweater her sister Noli had knitted for her. In the chaos of the processing line, as guards shouted and women wept, a moment of inexplicable grace occurred. The guards performing the search were inexplicably sloppy. Corrie, holding the Bible and sweater behind her back, was somehow overlooked. It was a small miracle she would attribute to divine intervention for the rest of her life. These items became critical tools for survival in the hell that awaited them. The vitamins, shared drop by drop, likely staved off the worst effects of malnutrition-related diseases for a small circle of women. But it was the Bible that became the heart of their new, clandestine community in Barracks 28. Every night, surrounded by a huddled mass of women from across Europe, Polish, French, Russian, Dutch, Corrie or Betsy would read from its tissue-thin pages. The language barrier was immense, but the message of hope transcended words. In a place designed to extinguish all human dignity, these secret readings became an act of spiritual warfare, a defiant declaration that their souls remained unconquered. Barracks 28, a haven in hell. Ravensbrück was a vision of man-made hell. The economic and logistical context was one of calculated deprivation. The camp was designed to work its prisoners to death. They slept on flea-infested, triple-tiered wooden bunks, with multiple women crammed onto a single lice-ridden straw mattress. The work was soul-crushing and physically destructive, digging, hauling stones, or working in munitions factories. Disease, dysentery, tuberculosis, typhus, was a constant, spectral presence. In this environment, Corrie and Betsy, along with hundreds of other women, were assigned to Barracks 28. It was one of the most overcrowded and squalid barracks in the entire camp. And yet, paradoxically, it became a sanctuary. The reason for this was revealed to them one day by a fellow prisoner. The guards never entered Barracks 28 because it was so thoroughly infested with fleas. The SS, in their obsession with order and cleanliness for themselves, were repulsed by the vermin. For the women inside, the fleas were a blessing in disguise. This small, biological detail created a pocket of autonomy. Within the flea-ridden walls of Barracks 28, the women could conduct their secret Bible studies without fear of interruption. The nightly scene, as described in Corrie's testimony, is one of the most powerful images of defiance in the entire Holocaust canon. In the dim, foul-smelling barracks, surrounded by the sounds of coughing and weeping, a community formed around the smuggled Bible. Betsy, her body growing weaker by the day, articulated her radical vision. They were to pray not just for themselves, but for their guards. They were to forgive their tormentors. This was a form of psychological resistance almost incomprehensible to the Nazi worldview. It was a strategy not for defeating the enemy physically, but for preventing the enemy's hatred from corrupting their own hearts. In the deepest pit of human cruelty, they cultivated forgiveness. Betsy's vision and her final days. By December 1944, the brutal conditions of Ravensbrück had taken their final toll on Betsy ten Boom. Starvation and sickness had reduced her to a skeletal figure, yet her spirit remained incandescent. As she lay dying on the filthy straw of her bunk, her body racked with pain, she shared a series of visions with Corrie. These visions were not merely fever dreams, they were detailed, concrete plans for the future. Her biographical and human factors were crystallized in these final moments. She described a large house in Holland, with large windows and a garden, that they would turn into a place of healing for those broken by the war. She envisioned a place where former prisoners, and even their former German guards, could learn to live again. She described turning a former concentration camp into a place of rehabilitation, painted green with window boxes full of flowers. These were not the ramblings of a dying woman but a coherent, strategic plan for post-war reconciliation. She was, in essence, outlining their next mission. She saw beyond the barbed wire, beyond the hatred and death, to a future that required not retribution, but healing. On December 20, 1944, Betsy died. Corrie managed to see her body in the camp morgue. The suffering had been erased from her face, she looked peaceful, almost joyful. Corrie felt a profound loss, but also a profound sense of purpose. Betsy's visions had become her new orders. The next day, a nurse secretly gave Corrie the blue sweater that had been stripped from Betsy's body, a final tangible link to the sister whose faith had illuminated the darkest corners of hell. Corrie, now alone, was left to carry their shared mission forward. The clerical error. Just a few days after Betsy's death, as 1944 drew to a close, a miracle of a different kind occurred, one born not of faith, but of bureaucratic incompetence. The camp loudspeakers crackled to life, calling out a list of numbers for release. To her utter astonishment, Corrie heard her own. There was no explanation. Along with a small group of other women, she was processed out of Ravensbrück. She was given back a few of her belongings and a train pass. She was free. For years, Corrie believed her release was a miracle from God, a direct answer to prayer. The historical analysis, however, uncovered a more mundane but no less astonishing truth decades later. A clerical error had been made in the camp's records. Her release had been a mistake. 1 week after she walked out of Ravensbrück, every other woman her age in the camp was executed in the gas chambers. The same machinery of death that had claimed millions, with its meticulous records and ruthless efficiency, had made a simple typo. A slip of a pen, a misfiled card, in the grand, brutal equation of the Holocaust, this tiny variable had saved her life. It was a staggering realization. Her survival had hinged on the same banal bureaucracy that had condemned so many others. Armed with Betsy's vision and granted a future by a clerical error, Corrie ten Boom began the long journey home, a solitary figure walking away from the gates of hell, carrying with her the stories of the dead and a mission to heal the living. The war for Europe was not yet over, but Corrie's personal battle was about to enter a new, and perhaps even more challenging, phase. The journey home. Corrie ten Boom's release from Ravensbrück in late December 1944 did not mark an immediate return to safety. It was the beginning of a perilous 10-day odyssey across a collapsing Third Reich. Germany was in its death throes. Allied bombers now owned the skies, and the transportation system was a chaotic wreck. Her journey, documented in her post-war accounts, provides a stark archival snapshot of a nation disintegrating. Holding a valid release form and a rail pass, she was technically free, but she was also a starving, emaciated woman in a land where every stranger was a potential threat. She traveled on hospital trains, a ghost among the wounded and dying German soldiers who were the wreckage of Hitler's war machine. The human factor was everywhere, the blank-eyed soldiers, the terrified civilians huddled in bombed-out train stations. The economic and logistical context was one of utter collapse. Food was almost non-existent. She survived on the kindness of a few strangers and the dregs of the Reich's failing supply lines. The irony was profound. After surviving a camp designed to kill her, she was now dependent on the broken infrastructure of her enemies to get home. Finally, she reached Groningen in the northern Netherlands, where she was taken in by a hospital. Here, for the first time in almost a year, she slept in a real bed and received proper medical care. After recuperating for several weeks, she was able to make the final leg of her journey to Haarlem, back to the Beje. But the home she returned to in February 1945 was a hollow shell. The ticking clocks were gone, sold off by the Germans. The house was cold and empty, haunted by the ghosts of her family and the 6 people they had saved. Her beloved father and sister were dead. The vibrant hub of resistance was now just a silent, scarred building. The war was not yet over, and Corrie stood in the ruins of her former life, facing the immense challenge of what to do next. Fulfilling the vision. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 brought celebration to the streets of Haarlem, but for Corrie, it brought a renewed sense of purpose. Betsy's dying visions from Ravensbrück were not just memories, they were a direct command. She immediately set to work. Her first project was to establish the house of healing Beje had described. Through donations and her own relentless determination, she acquired a large mansion in Bloemendal, a town near Haarlem. It was just as Beje had seen it, a grand house with large windows and beautiful gardens. This became a home for Dutch survivors of the concentration camps, a place where they could begin the slow, painful process of psychological and physical recovery. This was a pioneering effort in post-traumatic therapy. Corrie's strategy was simple but effective: create an environment of peace, beauty, and unconditional love, a direct antithesis to the ugliness and hatred of the camps. She understood that healing required more than just food and shelter, it required the restoration of dignity and hope. Her next, more radical step was to fulfill Beje's second vision. In 1946, she traveled to Germany, a nation universally reviled and in ruins. There, she secured the use of a former concentration camp in Darmstadt. The barbed wire was torn down, the barracks were painted green, and window boxes filled with flowers were installed, exactly as Beje had described. It was transformed into a place of refuge for displaced and destitute Germans, the very people whose nation had murdered her sister. This was a deeply controversial act. Many could not understand how she could help the enemy. But for Corrie, it was the ultimate application of Beje's philosophy: true victory was not in defeating your enemies, but in loving them. It was a bold, almost unbelievable act of reconciliation in a continent still raw with hatred. The test in Munich. In 1947, while speaking at a church in Munich, Corrie ten Boom faced the ultimate test of her own message. The story, a cornerstone of her biographical legacy, is a powerful case study in the psychology of forgiveness. After her sermon on God's forgiveness, a man approached her. He was balding, heavyset, and wearing a gray overcoat. As he came closer, a jolt of recognition shot through her like an electric current. She knew him. He had been a guard at Ravensbrück, one of the cruelest. She remembered his face, his uniform, the leering way he had watched the women as they were forced to shower. He was one of the men responsible for the degradation and death that had surrounded her, the man who had stood by as her sister Beje wasted away. Now, he stood before her, smiling, his hand outstretched. "I have become a Christian," he said enthusiastically. "I know that God has forgiven me for the cruel things I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well." He asked for her forgiveness. In that moment, the entire war, all the pain and loss, rushed back. Corrie's own account is brutally honest. She felt nothing but coldness, a paralytic hatred that froze her arm to her side. She, who had preached forgiveness to the world, could not perform this simple act. She prayed silently, desperately. "I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness." Then, she described what happened next not as an emotional change, but as a mechanical act of will. She forced her rigid arm up and placed her hand in his. As she did, she felt a current pass from her shoulder, through her arm, and into their joined hands. A warmth flooded her, bringing tears to her eyes. "I forgive you, brother," she cried out. "With all my heart." It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and the most profound victory of her life. She had not only preached Betsy's message, she had finally, and fully, lived it. The Watchmaker's global mission. The encounter in Munich solidified Corrie ten Boom's life's work. She realized that her story, and Betsy's message, was a powerful tool that the post-war world desperately needed to hear. The ordinary watchmaker from Haarlem embarked on an extraordinary global mission. From 1947 until her health failed in the late 1970s, she traveled to more than 60 countries, becoming as tramp for the Lord, as she called herself. Her equipment was now a suitcase and her Bible. Her strategy was storytelling. She spoke in packed churches, in prisons, in lecture halls, and on television, recounting the story of the Beje, the hiding place, and the horrors of Ravensbrück. Her narrative was unique because it did not end with liberation, it ended with reconciliation. The publication of her memoir, The Hiding Place, in 1971, co-authored with John and Elizabeth Sherrill, brought her story to millions. It became an international bestseller and was later adapted into a film. The book's power lay in its seamless integration of gripping narrative with deep spiritual analysis. It wasn't just a story about the Holocaust, it was a story about how faith can survive, and even triumph, in the face of unimaginable evil. She received numerous honors. She was knighted by the Queen of the Netherlands. The Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Israel honored her and her family as righteous among the nations, a title given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The Beje itself was turned into a museum, its rooms preserved, the hiding place restored for visitors to see. The small house in Haarlem became a global symbol of moral courage. Corrie ten Boom, the unlikely spy and resistance leader, had become one of the world's most prominent moral voices. Closing the file, legacy and analysis. Cornelia Corrie ten Boom died on April 15, 1983, on her 91st birthday. Her death marked the closing of a remarkable chapter of World War II history. The final analysis of her life and work reveals several critical insights. First, it underscores the power of unarmed resistance. The ten Booms fought the Nazi regime not with guns and explosives, but with compassion, ingenuity, and an unshakable moral framework. Their story demonstrates that civilian resistance, especially that of women on the home front, was a vital and effective part of the war effort. Second, their operation highlights the importance of networks. The Beje's success was not the work of one family alone but depended on a broad conspiracy of ordinary people, doctors, police officers, civil servants, farmers, who chose to act. It illustrates that widespread resistance is built on a foundation of trust and shared values. Third, Corrie's story provides an invaluable, deeply personal account of the concentration camp experience, particularly from a non-Jewish political prisoner's perspective. It documents not only the physical brutality but also the complex psychological and spiritual battles waged by inmates for their own humanity. Finally, the legacy of Corrie and Betsy ten Boom transcends the historical context of World War II. Their insistence on forgiveness as the final frontier of resistance offers a profound and challenging counter-narrative to the cycles of hatred and retribution that so often follow conflict. The file on the Watchmaker of Haarlem is ultimately not just a record of wartime heroism, but a timeless manual on the architecture of hope and the mechanics of grace. The clocks in the Beje may have stopped, but the message that came from within its walls continues to resonate, a quiet but powerful tick against the silence of history.